Hello, everyone, and welcome to this May edition of Stitches and Stories, where we'll be working on a craft project together while we listen to a couple of stories, thanks to LibriVox. So let's get started. I'm going to go over and talk about starting off your cross-stitch project for those that are new. And then we'll get into our stories. So this month, for the month of May, we're going to be doing Jigglypuff as our Pokemon cross-stitch kit. So if you want to stitch this particular craft along with me, make sure you pick up a kit from the Barkman branch and we can stitch along together. Otherwise, just grab whatever cross-stitch or embroidery or sewing project you have going at the moment, and you can work on that too. So as we're getting started again, let's review what we need. We need our needle. I've already got mine threaded with the color I'm going to be using. Our gridded pattern with our colors down here. And then in the kit, there comes this color chart with all of your floss already organized on it. You'll just have to pull them off and thread your needle with them. And then, as usual, there's a piece of felt in there too. So if you finish your Jigglypuff friend and you want to put him or her on a background, there's a background included in there for you. So with our Aida fabric, the way I find the center is by folding it in half one way. As you can see, I've already done it once. Fold it in half the other way, and that helps you find the middle, which I've marked here already with my pencil. And so then we want to find the middle on our pattern. And our patterns have these little arrows on the tops and sides so that we can find where the middle is. You can see I've already marked the middle of the pattern with a pencil mark as well, so I know where to start. And as you can see, all of the boxes around that dot are all the same color. So that tells me I'm going to start with 967, which is what I have threaded on my needle. So I just pulled one strand out of the 6-strand floss. If you grab it well enough, you can just pull it. So I just am using one, because it's easier for me to start that way. But you can use two if you like, but I like to use like our magic loop method. And so then you're going to take both ends and thread your needle with both ends so that the other end is a little loop instead of another set of ends. And then we're going to take our fabric, and remember with cross stitching, we're just kind of making little X's. So I'm going to go up and then over diagonally, and go down. Now, because we're doing the loop, we don't want to pull our thread all the way through, so we're going to get close until we have a little bit of a loop just left over. Slide our needle through that loop, and then you secure your back so that it's not going to go anywhere. And so what I'm going to do is, now that I've got one half stitch, I'm going to make half stitches in a square all around that center mark. So I've got my first 4 stitches halfway done. So the first 4 there, halfway done, and then I'm going to go back and finish them. So I'm going to start in the bottom and go diagonally in. And we say this with every cross-stitching project that we've posted, but it's good to make sure that all of your X's are going the same way. So you're doing one bar always first, and then the other way always second, so that they all look the same. The threads are all laying the same direction. It just looks nicer. So I've got my first 4 stitches done to match up with the 4 around my center. So from there, I'm going to look at what else is around. And because there's so much of this particular color, I could pretty much go anywhere I want to. There's a lot of this color. We just have to make sure we're counting correctly and that we don't overlap with any of the other colors, because then he'll end up with like a lopsided eyeball. His hair will be out of place. We don't want that to happen. So just keeping the counting in mind, we're going to keep going. And so as you all are getting set up with your cross-stitch project, let's talk a little bit about the stories we're going to be listening to today. I picked two, so it'll be a little bit less than half an hour of stories we'll be listening to. And I picked two stories that are by P.G. Wodehouse. And so P.G. Wodehouse was born in Guildford, England in 1881. Just for some context, that was 140 years ago. Originally, he began working as a banker, but he disliked it, and so he turned to writing instead. He would eventually become one of the most widely read humorists of the 20th century. And humorists are a group of writers which at that time included Mark Twain, Dorothy Parker, and Oscar Wilde, if you've ever heard of any of those other authors. The most popular characters that Wodehouse created in his writings were that of Bertie Wooster and his valet Jeeves, though he published over 90 books, 40 plays, and 200 short stories featuring various characters between 1902 and 1974. Most of his work is set in the United Kingdom. His work is known for using a mixture of Edwardian slang and literary techniques that are reminiscent of comic poetry and musical comedy. So hopefully as we're listening to our stories today, you'll pick up on some of the funny aspects of his writing technique. I usually laugh when I listen to his stories, so I hope you all do too. Wodehouse eventually passed away in 1975 at the age of 93 in New York. So let's talk about Jeeves and Wooster before. If you've never heard of them, there are in total 35 short stories and 11 novels featuring these characters. Most of them are told from Bertie Wooster's point of view, and the stories were published between 1915 and 1930, just to give you a context of where in time these stories are taking place. Of course, because we're listening through LibriVox, we have to pick public domain stories. So if any of you have ever used the search engine, ask.com or askjeeves.com, you might have noticed a butler figure on that website. And that was actually modeled after Wodehouse's Jeeves character. There was also a television series called Jeeves and Wooster, which ran for 4 seasons in the early 1990s and starred Hugh Laurie as Bertie Wooster, who was a bumbling, affable young gentleman and a member of the Idle Rich, just to give you an idea of what his character was like. And Stephen Fry was cast as Jeeves, who was Bertie's highly intelligent and competent valet. These were the characteristics of Bertie and Jeeves in Wodehouse's stories as well, with Bertie always seeming to be getting into various kinds of trouble and Jeeves coming up with a solution to the problem, sometimes whether Bertie liked it or not. The 2 stories we are listening to today were published into an anthology later that is referred to as The Inimitable Jeeves. Our LibriVox reader for these 2 stories is going to be Jacob Paul Starr. 2 other characters you should know about as we're getting ready to listen to these stories are Bertie's Aunt Agatha and Bingo Little. And we have to give some background on them because they're introduced in earlier stories, so they aren't given a lot of description in the stories we're listening to today. But Bertie's Aunt Agatha is usually presented in stories as trying to make Bertie get married or perform some task to support the family name. She's very like old school upper class snobby lady, I would say. Bertie is usually intimidated by her into doing things that he would rather not do. And that is also true of the stories we're going to listen to today. Bingo Little is another character. He's one of Bertie's friends who is often characterized as a person who is always falling in love quickly with somebody, which is also important for our stories, as we'll see today. Since P.G. Wodehouse was writing and publishing these stories roughly 100 years ago, there is some slang in the stories we're listening to that we might not have heard of before. So I just want to briefly go over some of the things you'll hear in our stories today before we get started. For one thing, Bertie refers to a girl as a pot of poison, which just means that she's dangerous or likely to be the death of you, which you'll understand more as you hear how the characters interact in the story, I think. Bertie comments on how his aunt made a bloomer, or a silly or embarrassing mistake that does not have serious results. But because it was a mistake that his Aunt Agatha made, she's probably mortified by it. Bertie comments on his friend's inability to, this is a weird one, to whack up the ginger to tell a girl he's in love with her. And to whack up the ginger just means to summon up the courage or spirit to do something. Originally, it was American slang. And then the last term that is kind of different and we might not have heard of before is someone behaving in a rummy manner, which just means odd, peculiar, or strange. Nothing too crazy, but sometimes it's good to know, especially those slang words. It can be interesting to see the type of words that people used to describe things 100 years ago. So let's get started with our first story. And then we'll pop right into our second one.
Chapter 5 of The Inimitable Jeeves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Inimitable Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 5. The pride of the Woosters is wounded. If there's one thing I like, it's a quiet life. I'm not one of those fellows who gets all restless and depressed if things aren't happening to them all the time. You can't make it too placid for me. Give me regular meals, a good show with decent music every now and then, and one or two pals to totter around with, and I ask no more. That is why the jar, when it came, was such a particularly nasty jar. I mean, I'd returned from Rowville with the sort of feeling that from now on nothing could occur to upset me. Aunt Agatha, I imagined, would require at least a year to recover from the Hemingway affair. And apart from Aunt Agatha, there isn't anybody who really does much in the way of harrying me. It seemed to me that the skies were blue, so to speak, and no clouds in sight. I little thought. Well, look here. What happened was this, and I ask you if it wasn't enough to rattle anybody. Once a year, Jeeves takes a couple of weeks' vacation and biffs off to the sea or somewhere to restore his tissues. Pretty rotten for me, of course, while he's away. But it has to be stuck, so I stick it. And I must admit that he usually manages to get a hold of a fairly decent fellow to look after me in his absence. Well, the time had come round again, and Jeeves was in the kitchen giving the understudy a few tips about his duties. I happened to want a stamp or something, and I toddled down the passage to ask him for it. The silly had left the kitchen door open, and I hadn't gone 2 steps when his voice caught me squarely in the eardrum. "You'll find Mr. Wooster," he was saying to the substitute chappie, "an exceedingly pleasant and amiable young gentleman, but not intelligent, by no means intelligent. Mentally he is negligible, quite negligible." Well, I mean to say what? I suppose, strictly speaking, I ought to have charged in and ticked the blighter off properly in no uncertain voice. But I doubt whether it's humanly possible to tick Jeeves off. Personally, I didn't even have a dash at it. I merely called for my hat and stick in a marked manner and legged it. But the memory rankled, if you know what I mean. We Woosters do not lightly forget. At least, we do some things, appointments, and people's birthdays, and letters to post, and all that. But not an absolute bally insult like the above. I brooded like the dickens. I was still brooding when I dropped in at the oyster bar at Buck's for a quick bracer. I needed a bracer rather particularly at the moment, because I was on my way to lunch with Aunt Agatha. A pretty frightful ordeal, believe me, or believe me not, even though I took it that after what happened at Rowville, she would be in a fairly subdued and amiable mood. I just had one quick and another rather slower, and was feeling about as cheerio as was possible under the circs, when a muffled voice hailed me from the northeast, and, turning round, I saw young Bingo Little propped up in a corner, wrapping himself round a sizable chunk of bread and cheese. "Hallo! Hallo! Hallo!" I said. "Haven't seen you for ages. You've not been in here lately, have you? No, I've been living out in the country. Eh? I said, for Bingo's loathing for the country was well known. Whereabouts? Down in Hampshire, at a place called Ditteridge. Oh, really? I know some people who've got a house there. The Glossops. Have you met them? Why, that's where I'm staying, said young Bingo. I'm tutoring that Glossop kid. What for? I said. I couldn't seem to see young Bingo as a tutor, though, of course, he did get a degree of sorts at Oxford, and I suppose you can always fool some of the people some of the time. What for? For money? Of course. An absolute sitter came unstitched in the second race at Haydock Park, said young Bingo, with some bitterness, and I dropped my entire month's allowance. I hadn't the nerve to touch my uncle for any more, so it was a case of buzzing round to the agents and getting a job. I've been down there 3 weeks. I haven't met the Glossop kid. Don't, advised Bingo briefly. The only one in the family I really know is the girl. I had hardly spoken these words when the most extraordinary change came over young Bingo's face. His eyes bulged, his cheeks flushed, and his Adam's apple hopped about like one of those India rubber balls on the top of the fountain in a shooting gallery. Oh, Bertie, he said in a strangled sort of voice. I looked at the poor fish anxiously. I knew that he was always falling in love with someone, but it didn't seem possible that even he could have fallen in love with Honoria Glossop. To me, the girl was simply nothing more or less than a pot of poison. One of those dashed, large, brainy, strenuous, dynamic girls you see so many of these days. She had been at Girton, where, in addition to enlarging her brain to the most frightful extent, she had gone in for every kind of sport and developed the physique of a middleweight catch-as-can wrestler. I'm not sure she didn't box for the varsity while she was up. The effect she had on me whenever she appeared was to make me want to slide into a cellar and lie low till they blew the all clear. Yet here was young Bingo, obviously all for her. There was no mistaking it. The love light was in the blighter's eyes. I worship her, Bertie. I worship the very ground she treads on, continued the patient in a loud, penetrating voice. Fred Thompson and one or two fellows had come in, and McGarry, the chappie behind the bar, was listening with his ears flapping. But there's no reticence about Bingo. He always reminds me of the hero in a musical comedy who takes the center of the stage, gathers the boys round him in a circle, and tells them all about his love at the top of his voice. Have you told her? No, I haven't had the nerve. But we walk together in the garden most evenings, and it sometimes seems to me that there's a look in her eyes. I know that look, like a sergeant major. Nothing of the kind, like a tender goddess. Half a sec, old thing, I said. Are you sure we're talking about the same girl? The one I mean is Honoria. Perhaps there's a younger sister or something I've not heard of? Her name is Honoria, bawled Bingo reverently. And she strikes you as a tender goddess? She does. God bless you, I said. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Another bit of bread and cheese, he said to the lad behind the bar. You're keeping your strength up, I said. This is my lunch. I've got to meet Oswald at Waterloo at 1:15 to catch the train back. I brought him up to town to see the dentist. Oswald? Is that the kid? Yes, pestilential to a degree. Pestilential? Hmm. That reminds me, I'm lunching with my Aunt Agatha. I'll have to pop off now, or I'll be late. I hadn't seen Aunt Agatha since the little affair of the pearls, and while I didn't anticipate any great pleasure for gnawing a bone in her society, I must say that there was one topic of conversation I felt pretty confident she wouldn't touch on, and that was the subject of my matrimonial future. I mean, when a woman's made a bloomer like the one Aunt Agatha made at Rowville, you'd naturally think that a decent shame would keep her off it, for, at any rate, a month or two. But women beat me. I mean to say, as regards nerve. You'll hardly credit it, but she actually started in on me with the fish. Absolutely with the fish, I give you my solemn word. We'd hardly exchanged a word about the weather, when she let me have it without a blush. Bertie, she said, I've been thinking about you and how necessary it is that you should get married. I'd quite admit that I was dreadfully mistaken in my opinion of that terrible, hypocritical girl at Rowville, but this time there is no danger of an error. By great good luck, I have found the very wife for you, a girl whom I have only recently met, but whose family is above suspicion. She has plenty of money, too, though that does not matter in your case. The great point is that she is strong, self-reliant, and sensible, and will counterbalance the deficiencies and weaknesses of your character. She has met you, and while there is naturally much in you of which she disapproves, she does not dislike you. I know this, for I have sounded her, guardedly, of course, and I am sure that you have only to make the first advances. Who is it? I would have said it long before, but the shock had made me swallow a bit of roll the wrong way, and I had only just finished turning purple and trying to get a bit of air back into the old windpipe. Who is it? Sir Roderick Glossop's daughter, Honoria. No, no, I cried, paling beneath the tan. Don't be silly, Bertie. She is just the wife for you. Yes, but look here. She would mold you. But I don't want to be molded. And Agatha gave me the kind of look she used to give me when I was a kid and had been found in the jam cupboard. Bertie, I hope you're not going to be troublesome. Well, but I mean, Lady Glossop has very kindly invited you to Ditteridge Hall for a few days. I told her you would be delighted to come down tomorrow. I'm sorry, but I've got a dashed important engagement tomorrow. What engagement? Well, you have no engagement, and even if you had, you must put it off. I shall be very seriously annoyed, Bertie, if you do not go to Ditteridge Hall tomorrow. Oh, righto, I said. It wasn't 2 minutes after I had parted from Aunt Agatha before the old fighting spirit of the Woosters reasserted itself. Ghastly as the peril was which loomed before me, I was conscious of a rummy sort of exhilaration. It was a tight corner, but the tighter the corner, I felt, the more juicily I should score off Jeeves when I got myself out of it, without a bit of help from him. Ordinarily, of course, I should have consulted him and trusted him to solve the difficulty, but after what I had heard him saying in the kitchen, I was dashed if I was going to demean myself. When I got home, I addressed the man with light abandon. Jeeves, I said, I'm in a bit of difficulty. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. Yes, quite a bad hole. In fact, you might say on the brink of a precipice, and faced by an awful doom. If I could be of any assistance, sir. Oh, no, no, no. Thanks very much, but no, no. I won't trouble you. I've no doubt I shall be able to get out of it all right by myself. Very good, sir. So that was that. I'm bound to say I'd have welcomed a bit more curiosity from the fellow, but that is Jeeves all over. Cloaks his emotions, if you know what I mean. Honoria was away when I got to Ditteridge on the following afternoon. Her mother told me that she was staying with some people named Brathwaite in the neighborhood, and would be back next day, bringing the daughter of the house with her for a visit. She said I would find Oswald out in the grounds, and such is a mother's love that she spoke as if that were a bit of a boost for the grounds and an inducement to go there. Rather decent, the grounds at Ditteridge. A couple of terraces, a bit of lawn with a cedar on it, a bit of shrubbery, and finally a small but goodish lake with a stone bridge running across it. Directly I had worked my way round the shrubbery, I spotted young Bingo leaning against the bridge smoking a cigarette. Sitting on the stonework, fishing, was a species of kid whom I took to be Oswald, the plague spot. Bingo was both surprised and delighted to see me, and introduced me to the kid. If the latter was surprised and delighted too, he concealed it like a diplomat. He just looked at me, raised his eyebrows slightly, and went on fishing. He was one of those supercilious striplings who gives you the impression that you went to the wrong school, and that your clothes don't fit. This is Oswald, said Bingo. What? I replied cordially. Could be sweeter. How are you? Oh, all right, said the kid. Nice place, this. Well, all right, said the kid. Having a good time fishing? Oh, all right, said the kid. Young Bingo led me off to commune apart. Doesn't jolly old Oswald's incessant flow of prattle make your head ache sometimes? I asked. Bingo sighed. It's a hard job. What's a hard job? Loving him. Do you love him? I asked, surprised. I shouldn't have thought it could be done. I try to, said young Bingo. For her sake. She's coming back tomorrow, Bertie. So I heard. She is coming, my love, my own. Absolutely, I said, but touching on young Oswald once more, do you have to be with him all day? How do you manage to stick it? Oh, he doesn't give me much trouble. When we aren't working, he sits on that bridge all the time, trying to catch tiddlers. Why don't you shove him in? Shove him in? It seems to me distinctly the thing to do, I said, regarding the stripling's back with a good deal of dislike. It would wake him up a bit, and make him take an interest in things. Bingo shook his head a bit wistfully. Your proposition attracts me, he said, but I'm afraid it can't be done. You see, she would never forgive me. She is devoted to that little brute. Great Scott! I cried. I've got it! I don't know if you know that feeling when you get an inspiration, and tingle all down your spine from the soft collar as now worn to the very soles of the old Wouldjeeves. Jeeves, I suppose, feels that way more or less all the time, but it isn't often it comes to me. But now all nature seemed to be shouting at me, You've clicked! And I grabbed young Bingo by the arm in a way that must have made him feel as if a horse had bitten him. His finely chiseled features were twisted with agony and what not, and he asked me what the dickens I thought I was playing at. Bingo, I said. What would Jeeves have done? How do you mean, what would Jeeves have done? I mean, what would he have advised in a case like yours? I mean, you wanting to make a hit with Honoria Glossop and all that. Why, take it from me, laddie, he would have shoved you behind that clump of bushes over there. He would have got me to lure Honoria onto that bridge somehow. Then, at the proper time, he would have told me to give the kid a pretty hefty jab in the small of the back, so as to shoot him into the water. And then you would have dived in and hauled him out. How about it? You didn't think that out by yourself, Bertie, said young Bingo in a hushed sort of voice. Yes, I did. Jeeves isn't the only fellow with ideas. But it's absolutely wonderful. Just a suggestion. The only objection I can see is that it would be so dashed awkward for you. I mean to say, suppose the kid turned round and said you had shoved him in. That would make you frightfully unpopular with her. I don't mind risking that. The man was deeply moved. Bertie, this is noble. No, no. He clasped my hand silently, then chuckled like the last drop of water going down the waste pipe in a bath. Now what? I said. I was only thinking, said young Bingo, how fearfully wet Oswald will get. Oh, happy day! End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Inimitable Jeeves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Inimitable Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 6. The Hero's Reward. I don't know if you've noticed it, but it's rummy how nothing in this world ever seems to be absolutely perfect. The drawback to this otherwise singularly fruity binge was, of course, the fact that Jeeves wouldn't be on the spot to watch me in action. Still, apart from that, there wasn't a flaw. The beauty of the thing was, you see, that nothing could possibly go wrong. You know how it is, as a rule, when you want to get Chappie A on spot B at exactly the same moment when Chappie C is on spot D. There's always a chance of a hitch. Take the case of a general. I mean to say, who's planning out a big movement. He tells one regiment to capture the hill with the windmill on it at the exact moment when another regiment is taking the bridgehead, or something down in the valley, and everything gets all messed up. And then when they're chatting the thing over in camp that night, the colonel of the first regiment says, Oh, sorry, did you say the hill with the windmill? I thought you said the one with the flock of sheep. And there you are. But in this case, nothing like that could happen, because Oswald and Bingo would be on the spot right along, so that all I had to worry about was getting Honoria there in due season. And I managed that all right, first shot, by asking her if she would come for a stroll in the grounds with me, as I had something particular to say to her. She had arrived shortly after lunch in the car with the Brathwaite girl. I was introduced to the latter, a tallish girl with blue eyes and fair hair. I rather took to her. She was so unlike Honoria, and if I had been able to spare the time, I shouldn't have minded talking to her for a bit. But business was business. I had fixed it up with Bingo to be behind the bushes at 3 sharp, so I got hold of Honoria and steered her out through the grounds in the direction of the lake. "You're very quiet, Mr. Wooster," she said. Made me jump a bit. I was concentrating pretty tensely at the moment. We had just come in sight of the lake, and I was casting a keen eye over the ground to see that everything was in order. Everything appeared to be as arranged. The kid Oswald was hunched up on the bridge, and as Bingo wasn't visible, I took it that he had got into position. My watch made it 2 minutes after the hour. "Eh?" I said. "Oh, yes, I was just thinking. You said you had something important to say to me." Absolutely." I had decided to open the proceedings by sort of paving the way for young Bingo. I mean to say, without actually mentioning his name. I wanted to prepare the girl's mind for the fact that, surprising as it might seem, there was someone who had long loved her from afar, and all that sort of rot. "It's like this," I said. "It may sound rummy and all that, but there's somebody who's frightfully in love with you, and so forth. A friend of mine, you know." "Oh, a friend of yours?" "Yes." She gave a kind of laugh. "Well, why doesn't he tell me so?" "Well, you see, that's the sort of chap he is. Kind of shrinking, diffident kind of fellow. Hasn't got the nerve. Thinks you so much above him, don't you know. Looks on you as a sort of a goddess. Worships the ground you tread on, but can't whack up the ginger to tell you so." "This is very interesting." "Yes, he's not a bad chap, you know, in his way. Well, that's the pushish. You might just bear it in mind, what?" "How funny you are." She chucked her head back and laughed with considerable vim. She had a penetrating sort of laugh, rather like a train going into a tunnel. It didn't sound over musical to me, and on the kid Oswald it appeared to jar not a little. He gazed at us with a good deal of dislike. "I wish the dickens you wouldn't make that row," he said, "scaring all the fish away." It broke the spell a bit. Honoria changed the subject. "I do wish Oswald wouldn't sit on the bridge like that," she said. "I'm sure it isn't safe. He might easily fall in." "I'll go and tell him," I said. I suppose the distance between the kid and me at this juncture was about 5 yards, but I got the impression that it was nearer 100, and as I started to toddle across the intervening space, I had a rummy feeling that I'd done this very thing before. Then I remembered. Years ago, at a country house party, I had been roped in to play the part of a butler in some amateur theatricals in aid of some ghastly charity or other, and I had had to open the proceedings by walking across the empty stage from left upper entrance and shoving a tray on a table down right. They had impressed it on me at rehearsals that I mustn't take the course at a quick keel and toe, like a chappie finishing strongly in a walking race, and the result was that I kept the brakes on to such an extent that it seemed to me as if I was never going to get to the bally table at all. The stage seemed to stretch out in front of me like a trackless desert, and there was a kind of breathless hush, as if all nature had paused to concentrate its attention on me personally. Well, I felt just like that now. I had a kind of dry gulping in my throat, and the more I walked, the farther away the kid seemed to get, till suddenly I found myself standing just behind him, without quite knowing how I'd got there. "Hallo!" I said, with a sickly sort of grin, wasted on the kid because he didn't bother to turn round and look at me. He merely wiggled his left ear in a rather peevish manner. I don't know when I've met anybody in whose life I appeared to mean so little. "Hallo!" I said. "Fishing?" I laid my hand in a sort of elderly brother way on his shoulder. "Here, look out!" said the kid, wobbling on his foundations. It was one of those things that want doing quickly or not at all. I shut my eyes and pushed. Something seemed to give. There was a scrambling sound, a kind of yelp, a scream in the offing, and a splash, and so the long day wore on, so to speak. I opened my eyes. The kid was just coming to the surface. "Help!" I shouted, cocking an eye on the bush from which young Bingo was scheduled to emerge. Nothing happened. Young Bingo didn't emerge to the slightest extent whatever. "I say, help!" I shouted again. I don't want to bore you with reminiscences of my theatrical career, but I must just touch once more on that appearance of mine as a butler. The scheme on that occasion had been that when I put the tray on the table, the heroine would come on and say a few words to get me off. Well, on the night, the misguided female forgot to stand by, and it was a full minute before the search party located her and shot her onto the stage. And all that time I had to stand there, waiting. A rotten sensation, believe me. And this was just the same, only worse. I understood what these writer chappies mean when they talk about time standing still. Meanwhile, the kid Oswald was presumably being cut off in his prime, and it began to seem to me that some sort of steps ought to be taken about it. What I had seen of the lad hadn't particularly endeared to me, but it was undoubtedly a bit thick to let him pass away. I don't know when I have seen anything more grubby and unpleasant than the lake as viewed from the bridge, but the thing apparently had to be done. I chucked off my coat and vaulted over. It seems rummy that water should be so much wetter when you go into it with your clothes on than when you're just bathing. But take it from me, that it is. I was only under about 3 seconds, I suppose, but I came up feeling like the bodies you read of in the paper, which had evidently been in the water several days. I felt clammy and bloated. At this point, the scenario struck another snag. I had assumed that directly I came to the surface, I should get hold of the kid and steer him courageously to the shore. But he hadn't waited to be steered. When I had finished getting the water out of my eyes and had time to take a look around, I saw him about 10 yards away, going strongly and using, I think, the Australian crawl. The spectacle took all the heart out of me. I mean to say, the whole essence of a rescue, if you know what I mean, is that the party of the second part shall keep fairly still and in one spot. If he starts swimming off on his own account, and can obviously give you at least 40 yards in the 100, where are you? The whole thing falls through. It didn't seem to me that there was much to be done except get ashore, so I got ashore. By the time I had landed, the kid was halfway to the house. Look at it from whatever angle you like. The thing was a washout. I was interrupted in my meditations by a noise like the Scotch Express going under a bridge. It was Honoria Glossop, laughing. She was standing at my elbow, looking at me in a rummy manner. "Oh, Bertie, you are funny," she said. And even in that moment there seemed to me something sinister in the words. She had never called me anything except Mr. Wooster before. "How wet you are." "Yes, I am wet." "You had better hurry into the house and change." "Yes." I wrung a gallon or two of water out of my clothes. "You are funny," she said again. "First proposing in that extraordinary roundabout way, and then pushing poor little Oswald into the lake so as to impress me by saving him." I managed to get the water out of my throat sufficiently to try to correct this fearful impression. No, no. He said you pushed him in, and I saw you do it. Oh, I'm not angry, Bertie. I think it was sweet of you. But I'm quite sure it's time that I took you in hand. You certainly want someone to look after you. You've been seeing too many moving pictures. I suppose the next thing you would have done would have been to set the house on fire so as to rescue me. She looked at me in a proprietary sort of way. "I think," she said, "I shall be able to make something of you, Bertie. It is true yours has been a wasted life up to the present, but you are still young, and there is a lot of good in you." "No, really there isn't." "Oh, yes, there is. It simply wants bringing out. Now you run straight up into the house and change your wet clothes, or you will catch cold." And, if you know what I mean, there was a sort of motherly note in her voice, which seemed to tell me, even more than her actual words, that I was for it. As I was coming downstairs after changing, I ran into young Bingo, looking festive to a degree. "Bertie," he said, "just the man I wanted to see. Bertie, a wonderful thing has happened." "You blighter!" I cried. "What became of you? Do you know? Oh, you mean about being in those bushes? I hadn't time to tell you about that. It's all off." "All off?" "Bertie, I was actually starting to hide in those bushes when the most extraordinary thing happened. Walking across the lawn, I saw the most radiant, the most beautiful girl in the world. There is none like her. None. Bertie, do you believe in love at first sight? You do believe in love at first sight, don't you, Bertie, old man? Directly I saw her, She seemed to draw me like a magnet. I seemed to forget everything. We two were alone in a world of music and sunshine. I joined her. I got into a conversation. She is a Miss Brothwaite, Bertie, Daphne Brothwaite. Directly our eyes met, I realized that what I had imagined to be my love for Honoria Glossop had been a mere passing whim. Bertie, you do believe in love at first sight, don't you? She is so wonderful, so sympathetic, like a tender goddess. At this point, I left the blighter. 2 days I got a letter from Jeeves. The weather, it ended, continues fine. I have had one exceedingly enjoyable bathe. I gave one of those hollow, mirthless laughs and went downstairs to join Honoria. I had an appointment with her in the drawing room. She was going to read Ruskin to me. End of chapter 6.